Stephen. Hi everyone. Hello to folk visiting, joining us from online. Lovely to see you. Welcome, and to those who are in the James Arnott Theatre with us in person this afternoon, a warm welcome to you too. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Dee Hedden and I'm the James Arnott Chair in Drama here at the University of Glasgow. And it's lovely to welcome everyone to our first Glasgow Theatre Studies seminar this afternoon, which I'm delighted is being presented by Ashanti Harris, who I will introduce in a moment. But first of all, I just want to say that Ashanti has been our first inaugural practitioner in residency in the Scottish Theatre Archive. First inaugural, hopefully not last, but all dependent on funding, of course, as we all know everything is. So it was a bit of an experiment for us, this. And when we put the call out for proposals of interest, we had about 50 and they were all really brilliant. Ashanti's was the most brilliant, which is why Ashanti's here. But it just shows how much interest I think there is across the professional practitioner sector to get into any archives that there are. And unfortunately, the funding to support that is pretty scant. So I was delighted that we were able to do this in theatre studies and with the support of theatre studies team to enable that to happen, but most particularly through the support and really excitement and enthusiasm of our colleagues in the archives, and in particular Moira Rankin. We could not have done this without Moira. Moira's not in the room yet. She might be online. She's not here. She might join us. But I just wanted to make a clear thanks to Moira and her team for supporting us. So Ashanti is a transdisciplinary artist, researcher and lecturer based here in Glasgow. Ashanti works between dance, performance, facilitation, sound, installation and writing. And Ashanti's work disrupts dominant historical narratives and reimagines them from a Caribbean diasporic perspective. It's great news to know that Ashanti is now also an artist in residence from 25 to 2028 at Deveron Projects in Huntly, which I know quite well. I've done some stuff with them too, and it's a brilliant place to be working. Well done. Ashanti was also the 2024 recipient of the John Florence Stone Fellowship at Edinburgh College of Art, is co-founder of Project X, a community interest company platforming dance of the African and Caribbean diaspora in Scotland, really brilliant company, and a member of the research cohort for Body Remedy, a forming ecology centering the experience of Black people and people of colour who identify as women and or non-binary. So it really is a pleasure and privilege, Ashanti, to have you here this afternoon to share what you've been doing in the Scottish Theatre Archives. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I shall hand over to you and I shall sit down.
Thank you, Dee. I'm just going to jump right in. Anyone that knows me, I've written loads. So I'm going to try and get through it so that there's time for questions at the end. And hopefully everything will become clear. So a little bit of a pretext for the research that I've been doing. I just wanted to start with this. African and Caribbean culture, Black culture, surfaced within Scottish society centuries ago, and its presence has made its mark on culture in a variety of different ways, which continues to find expression in today's multicultural society. That being said, historically, African and Caribbean diasporic art forms have, for the most part, been rendered invisible within Scottish cultural or historical institutions. And without legacy, these art forms are continuously relegated to the category of emerging, or in other words, newly arrived. And this newly arrived narrative not only denies the contribution of these art forms to Scottish history and culture, it also continues insidious white supremacist narratives, which are sadly becoming more and more prevalent in today's political climate. So challenging these notions, this research in the Scottish Theatre Archives performs a retelling of Black history in a Scottish context, searching for the loves, the legacies, and the ancestors that paved the way for contemporary Black and POC performance makers working in Scotland now. And I also wanted to do a little note about translation. So before getting into the presentation, I'm going to share some thinking that shaped my approach to analysing information and texts, especially in the context of working with archives. So in The Politics of Translation, a seminal text by the literary critic Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak refers to the process of translation as the most intimate act of reading, recognizing it's not just words from which the meaning is made, meaning is also present in the silence between and around the words. Therefore, the history of the language, the history of the author's moment, the history of the language in and as translation must figure into the weaving as well. So Spivak here is talking about translating between languages, and much more specifically, translating between the indigenous languages of the colonized and the dominant languages of the colonizer. However, I found that when researching any hidden, silenced, or marginalized histories, especially those relating to performance and the physical presence of marginalized people, it's in many cases not dissimilar from the act of translating between the languages of the colonized and the colonizer. The live performing subject is inherently embodied and therefore impossible to disentangle from their wider context. Archives in themselves are a construct of the colonizer and will consequently be communicating in the language of the colonizer, especially archives or archival documents created during the high reign of British Empire, which many of them were. So in recognizing this, the process of researching the legacies of Black history within Scotland's cultural heritage also requires an interrogation of the ways in which the historical hierarchical relationship between Blackness and whiteness, or between Scotland and the colonies of the British Empire, has affected how these Black histories have been and continue to be understood and represented. The complexities present within this research therefore requires a certain amount of relational thinking, and as Spivak says, it requires the most intimate act of reading. It requires touching the silences in the documents, feeling the histories in my own body, and tenderly holding them close when the surrounding contents are maybe hurtful or harmful, carving a space for the silenced narratives and reading from a place of love. And I want to do one more note about the footage on the screen. So this footage that's playing shows the handling of some of the archival documents that I looked at during the residency. They aren't in any particular order, and even though some items I might refer to in the talk do feature in the footage, they will not necessarily come up at the point that I'm talking about them. However, I think this footage is a much more appropriate representation of what it's like to do this kind of research in an archive. It's not like a library where you can browse the shelves. The online catalogue only holds limited information, and often I would find myself requesting items on a hunch that could be interesting and were always useful to see, but not always relevant to the thread I might have been following. Requests for items can be made twice a day for 5 items maximum, and you can view 3 of those items at a time. Amongst all of these isolated views of the items, you also need to keep track of what was what and what you haven't seen yet and what you need to return to. And this wasn't a bad thing. And sometimes this way of looking meant that 2 items seemingly unrelated and possibly separated by decades or even centuries might speak to each other and provide insights between items that I might never have otherwise come across. And so in sharing this footage, as I speak, I hope that the same might happen for you watching today. Hopefully you can see it okay online. I hope that you might be able to make your own connections between the items on screen and the things that I'm speaking about, enabling even more insights into the research. So I will begin my talk of looking for love in the archives. So the first time I engaged with the Scottish Theatre Archives was in 2017, when I was researching the presence and legacies of African and Caribbean dance in Scotland. I was looking into Le Ballet Neg, also known as Britain's first Black dance company, and I had learnt from a tallist that they had performed in Glasgow sometime between their formation in 1946 and the closing of the company in 1952. To give a little more context about Le Ballet Neg, they formed in 1946 under the leadership of Berto Pasuka, a Jamaican dancer and choreographer who came to Britain in 1939, pre-Windrush, with dreams of forming a culturally diverse dance company to showcase the dances of the Black diaspora. Le Ballet Neg included members from Jamaica, Trinidad, Ghana, Nigeria, Spain, England, and Scotland, and their choreography combined traditional European ballet and modern dance structures with the cultural dances of the Caribbean and West Africa. So when I learned that La Bale Neg performed in Glasgow, I was really eager to find out when and where and what the impact of their presence was. I found that the Scottish Theatre Archives in Glasgow University's Special Collections had a programme for their week run of performances on the 15th of July in the Theatre Royal in Glasgow. I was very excited to find this. And from this, I learned that the company performed 4 incredibly political dances. I got so obsessed with learning about these dances and the insight that was being performed in Glasgow. So they performed these 4 dances from their repertoire in Scotland, but there was no year attached to the archival document. Furthermore, at that time, the document did not list the name La Bale Neg, but instead the Negro Ballet. There were so many missing pieces and so many reasons why Britain's first black dance company might exist almost invisibly or like a shadow in the Scottish Theatre Archives. But this was the beginning of a romance for me. I was so inspired and in love with this dance company, whose dances were informed by Marcus Garvey's philosophies of Black pride and addressed the surrounding racial politics within the UK and its empire. Their work framed the Black experience across history and reimagined the boundaries of cultural and social norms. I was committed to delving into the depths of the archive if it meant I could find them in Scotland and find more things to love about them. So, to cut a long story short, I did find out a lot more about La Bale Neg and the various legacies of their trip to Scotland, including the year of that first performance in the Theatre Royal, which was 1946 and part of their very first UK tour. I learned that they recruited a dancer from Glasgow. I still to this day don't have a name for the Glaswegian dancer, but a transcribed interview with the company's co-choreographer Richie Riley, held in the Brixton Cultural Archives in London, confirms that a black dancer from Glasgow joined the company, a black dancer who was living in Glasgow around 1946. I know that the choreographer Berto Pasuka posed for the Scottish-Estonian sculptor Benno Schatz, resulting in a bronze bust of Berto Pasuka, which is currently part of the collection in Paisley Museum and has been, I think, since it was originally commissioned, and also will be on display when Paisley Museum eventually reopens. I know that the company liked to go out dancing in dance halls after their performances, presumably where they met their new recruits, and I knew how important the company was to its members. In an interview in the Daily Record in 1946, after the performances in Scotland, dancer Ben Johnson, who originally came to Britain to become a dentist, claimed, "When I heard the drums, I said, this is it. This is all that matters. This is really worth working for. We never knew what self-expression was till Pasuka made us dance." This statement demonstrates the significance of the work of Berto Pasuka and La Bale Neg to the Black people in Britain whose daily experiences reflected the racial inequality of the British Empire. Through the platform of La Bale Neg, Black dancers were able to share, critique, and unravel their experiences from their own perspective, experiences which still speak to me as a Black performer in Scotland almost 80 years later. So I've said it already, I was inspired, I was in love, and my research romance blossomed into a thesis, multiple performances, and most recently a commissioned video work about the dance company for the reopening of Paisley Museum to accompany the bronze bust of Berto Pasuka. But more importantly, it confirmed for me something that I'd always felt and known inside, but couldn't always see, that we are here, that we have been here, that Black artists, performers, practitioners, and people have a history here in Scotland. So continuing this research in residency with the Scottish Theatre Archives over this past summer, I proposed to use the concept of a research romance as a creative methodology for uncovering Black histories in the Scottish Theatre Archive. Inspired by my relationship with La Bale Neg, I proposed a love story in the making, looking for what is hidden, hard to see, or difficult to understand. Following the traces, being led by feelings, and my commitment to researching Black histories from a place of love. I approached this searching for love in the archives as a performative act in itself that included the understanding that I might not find exactly what I was looking for, but allowing the performance and the research to find a form in the act of longful searching. And in answer to the questions I'm sure you're all asking in your head, did you find love? Were you just finding heartbreak? Yes, I did. I found love, I found heartbreak, I found all of those things. Yes, I met practitioners to fall in love with and to obsess over. I also felt heartbreak many times over. I laughed immensely reading through endless scripts, sometimes in pure joy and sometimes in absolute disbelief. I met Black performers with no names. I met named performers in blackface. I got lost in labyrinths of social, political, and cultural connections between Scotland and the countries of the British Empire and ideals of white supremacy. I followed routes that led me all the way to the present day and my own networks of creative practitioners of colour in Scotland. And the routes were anything but straightforward. Some visits, I would read pages of documents over multiple days, and the person whose trail I was following would lead only to a dead end. Some visits, the trail I was following would intersect with another trail, and I would be temporarily led in a different direction, following someone or something else. In those cases, it often became difficult to find my way back to the person or possibility that I'd originally been chasing. Some visits, I would get so incredibly frustrated at the gaps and the holes and the silences in the documents, and I would look longingly towards the 12th floor views across Glasgow, knowing that somewhere in those lines of tenements and tower blocks, someone out there had the answers that were not held in the documents in this building. Some visits, the reality of the task became too heavy to hold, and I would have to put it down. I have experienced this working with archival materials in the past. Absorbing racist language and racist ideals, which were considered normal at the time, is incredibly, incredibly painful and difficult. Reading these painful words, the language travels across time and imprints itself on my own body, becoming at best discomfort and at worst physical pain. Some visits I felt resilient enough to sit with the pain, and on other visits I didn't. And why is this important to mention? Because these are all the human factors to be considered when doing this kind of research without any pretenses of objectivity. My research and practice are guided by a decolonial methodology as a personal response to the history of colonialism and its present day reverberations, which shape a particular relationship between mind and body for historically colonized people. As an artist working with my own body, the body of a Guyanese British woman with brown skin and a Yorkshire accent, I've become aware of the ways in which my living, moving, speaking, dancing body can be read and written upon with expressions of otherness, especially within a discourse which represents Black people as objects to be looked at rather than self-constituting subjects, which more and more at the moment with this kind of build of right-wing rhetoric happening all over social media and in the news, this is something I previously took this line out of past talks, but I felt the need to put it back in. I'm not objective in this research. I'm a Black artist and I want to celebrate Black artists, practitioners, people, histories, and culture. I want to feel pride in my history and I want to love and be loved in this research. So thinking back to my earlier research into Labali Neg and the difficulties I faced locating the archival documents until I learned that they were often referred to in newspapers and playbills as the Negro Ballet, it pained me to refer to them as the Negro Ballet, especially when their own chosen name, Le Ballet Neg, was in itself a political statement in protest of the term Negro, an attempt to take ownership of the term Black with the French word négres, which references the French political movement of negritude, which promoted Black pride and African culture as a response to French colonialism and racism. However, it was also this racist term which enabled me to find so much more about them in the archives. And this shouldn't have been so surprising to me. Archives and special collections, as we know them today in the UK, are institutions developed from the racist foundations of empire. Archives played a central role in the British Empire by serving as a tool for administrative control, knowledge creation, and governance across vast territories. They were used to organize information for governing, which enabled the centralized control of dispersed colonies. Archives documented the civilizing mission and exploitation of colonial rule and served as a resource for imperial officials. Archival processes also involved the selective removal and destruction of records concealing aspects of imperial history, such as abuses during decolonization, as well as the removal of any record or presence of pre-colonial culture which challenged their ideals of white supremacy and imperialism. The term Negro, amongst other racist terms and depictions of Black culture, was a reality of the time that La Bale Neg had to exist within. It was part of Berto Pasuka's impetus to do the work he did in the first place, sharing his own love of Black culture in protest of the hateful and denigrating language and ideals of the British Empire in the 1940s and 50s. So as a little example, searching the term Caribbean in the Scottish Theatre Archives leads me to just 3 items, with only 2 of these items being relevant to my research and both of these relevant items being much more recent events showcasing Caribbean culture in the 80s and 90s. Searching the term African comes up with 11 results, however, only 8 being relevant to my search, and 6 of those 8 relevant items all referring to the same 1997 reading of Stories from Under African Skies on BBC Radio Scotland, which is great for anyone researching these texts and their authors, their incredible texts. But as someone who remembers 1997 and knows these texts well, I already love them. I didn't feel like they were relevant to my search for new loves. However, searching the term Negro in the Scottish Theatre Archives takes me to a 1947 newspaper advert announcing a new theatre production company for coloured actors with links to Glasgow's Citizens Theatre through the company's trustee, Dame Sybil Thorndike. It took me to a 1953 performance in Glasgow's Alhambra of Anna Lucastra by the American Negro Theatre Guild, and starring incredibly notable figures such as B. Freeman, who was a star in multiple Oscar Michaud films. Oscar Michaud was a major character in American film history. He was the first African-American to make a feature-length film, and he was a pioneer of independent cinema. The show also included Ken Freeman, who later became the historian for the Negro Actors Guild, worked as a drama critic and theatre columnist for the West Indian American newspaper, and he also had a role in Because I Am Black, a play performed by the Birmingham Repertory Company in England, becoming the first American to act in a British repertory company. And the show also included Frederick O'Neill, who was not just the founder of the American Negro Theatre, but also the founder of the British Negro Theatre, and was the first African-American president of the Actors Equity Association. Searching this term also brought me to a 1957 performance in the King's Theatre in Glasgow by the New York Negro Ballet, originally known as Ballet Americana, and was one of the first all-Black ballet companies in the United States. And finally, the search brought me to the term that I'm going to start with today. Reference GB 247 STA 2FA 2/42, item the Highland Fair 1952. This man's face is beautiful. Today, the database is undergoing maintenance, so I'm meeting the archival resources nameless. Right now, I'm looking at a large folded piece of yellowing drawing paper with a beautiful painting of a Black man dressed in purple colonial costume, full of pomp, with lilac gloves, a white frilled shirt under extravagant purple and hot pink dress jacket, blue trousers covered by purple and lilac knee-high socks, and wearing a pink turban decorated with chains of beads and 3 large feathers in lilac, pink, and orange. Excuse me. In his hands, he holds a long, barely painted object that could be a scepter or a cane or a knife on a very long pole. He holds it slightly raised and gazes up at it. There is a small pencil drawing to the left of his image, detailing the shape of the embroidery on his jacket. In the top left-hand corner is the title, Negro Attendant. On the right side of the fold is a pencil drawing of possibly the same person in the same outfit, but this time with no color and viewed from the back, detailing the pleats in his dress jacket and the coiling shape of the embroidery. To the left of the pencil drawing is another small detail drawn in pencil, but I'm unclear as to what it's illustrating. In the top right corner, there are the words Highland Fair. In the second drawing, the man's left leg points slightly behind him, like the stance of a dancer. His hands are gently stretched out in front of him, as if he's holding something between each hand in a gesture of offering. One of the archivists, Sorrel, has brought me a post-it note with some of the hidden details from the currently unavailable database. The item is part of the archive of Molly McEwen Designs. This specific one is a design for a production at the Citizens Theatre called the Highland Fair. That will be my lead for tomorrow. The Highland Fair was originally a Scots opera written by Scottish dramatist Joseph Mitchell and published in 1731 under the title of The Highland Fair or a Union of the Clans, an Opera. The story is a kind of Romeo and Juliet tale of a budding romance against the backdrop of two warring clans brought together at an annual Highland Fair through a series of events are forced to reconcile their differences. Over 200 years later, in 1952, Scottish playwright Robert Kemp wrote a contemporary adaptation of the 18th century opera, which was produced by Tyrone Guthrie in association with the Old Vic and Glasgow Citizens Theatre, and was performed as part of the 1952 Edinburgh International Festival of Music and Drama. The performance of the Highland Fair was a celebration of Scottish culture and heritage and included spectacular costumes inspired by traditional Scottish dress, traditional Highland music and dancing, with a light-hearted comedic script. Amongst the roles listed in the programme, there was not a Negro attendant, but there was one part titled An Attendant, which was played by Lloyd Record. With nothing else about Lloyd Record available in the Special Collections catalogue, a quick internet search informed me that he was a Jamaican actor, filmmaker, and stage director who lived in the UK for a number of years. Now, Lloyd Record is a really interesting historical figure to have come across in the Scottish Theatre archives. In the late 50s, after his performance in the Highland Fair, he appeared in the West End production of Hot Summer Night, and later the ITV adaptation, which became the earliest known example of an interracial kiss broadcast on television. In 1960, Lloyd Record formed London's first West Indian theatre company, the New Dax Theatre Company at the Royal Court Theatre. And later in the 60s, he went on to explore a career in filmmaking and made two non-commercial short films. The first film, 10 Bob in Winter, 1963, which is available to watch on BFI if anyone's interested, included among its cast the very well-known Jamaican novelist and poet Andrew Salkey, and a jazz score by Joe Harriott, a Jamaican jazz musician and composer who was a key figure in the development of free jazz in Britain. The second film, Dream A40, 1965, was a daring look at love and sexuality in 1960s Britain, following a young gay couple as they embark on a road trip. The film was made before the Sexual Offences Act in 1967 and is considered to have advanced the cause of homosexual equality. The 1967 Act decriminalized consenting relationships between men in private. So when Lloyd Record made this film, homosexuality essentially was still illegal. So I don't know about all of you, but that was enough to get me absolutely hooked with Lloyd Record. And I had so many more questions. There was just so much more to find out. Amongst them, how long was Lloyd Record in Scotland? What was the part he played in the Highland Fair? What part did Lloyd Record play in this important piece of Scottish performance history? The 1952 performance of the Highland Fair was a huge success and was subsequently programmed for the 1953 Edinburgh International Festival as well. Whilst looking through a scrapbook made by one of the show's performers, I came across a newspaper clipping titled "Wanted a Coloured Actor." Oh, that's good timing. An urgent appeal has gone out from Glasgow's Citizens Theatre, who are producing the Highland Fair during the last week of the Edinburgh Festival. At the last moment, a coloured youth who was to have played the part of an attendant in the show has withdrawn. Now a frantic search is going on to find a replacement for this small but important part. Any coloured youth between 17 and 25 is invited to the Assembly Hall for an audition. He must be of medium height but doesn't necessarily need stage experience. Well, this advert answered one of my questions. Lloyd Record did not continue in the Highland Fair in 1953. His time in Scotland may well have been short, arriving in England in 1951, performing in Scotland in 1952, but not in 1953. But this advert brought my attention back to the original drawing of the costume for the attendant, which was clearly designed for a black performer. The newspaper advert confirmed that the role could not be replaced by a white performer. This time, I needed to turn to the script. I began with the original 18th century Scots opera, already with an idea in my mind as to how the character might feature in the script. Past research projects had already made me very aware of Scotland's participation in the transatlantic slave trade as colonizers in the Caribbean, especially the participation of Scots from the Highlands, the Black Isle, and Sutherland, who were heavily involved in the plantation economies of my own birth country, Guyana, leading to the presence of Black Guyanese people in Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries. The concept of a Black attendant figure being an important part of 18th century Scottish history was not completely unsurprising to me, and I was intrigued to find out how this small but important part might have been written into the play. However, reading through every page of dialogue and song lyrics, there was no reference in the text to an attendant character. I moved on to the script for the adaptation written in 1952. The role of the attendant is clearly stated, but the character didn't ever make an appearance at any point in the script, even as a background reference. I read through every review and newspaper article about the show that I could get my hands on, and aside from the advert seeking a coloured actor, there was never any reference to this role, and I was baffled. The advert described the role as small but important. The costume designer had been commissioned to design a costume specifically for a Black character. I could even see the character depicted in the illustration of the show on the front page of its program. The character very clearly existed, but without seeing the show myself or speaking to somebody who had seen the show, I didn't know anything about this small but important role. I did learn that in the 1953 performance, the role was played by a performer named Lynn Bram, with a very specific spelling of Lynn. Further search of this name didn't lead me to anything obvious like it did with Lloyd Record. Lynn Bram only existed in the shadows of the internet, but a deep, deep dive eventually led me to the Future Histories Archive for African, Asian, and Caribbean performing arts in the UK. Within their collection of items related to the Black Theatre Forum was an undigitized play script for a play titled Lord of the Manor, written in 1986 by Lynn Bram, with the correct spelling of Lynn, which is a rare one. Now, this would have been 33 years after the performance of the Highland Fair, and Lynn Bram would have been approximately somewhere between age 50 and age 58 when they wrote that play. And without going down to view the physical play script, which was held in an archive in London, I can only imagine what the play was about and the possibilities that Lynn's experiences in the Highland Fair might have in some way fed into this play that they wrote 33 years later, or if anything in this play might give me an insight into Lynn's life in Scotland. So this is an interesting moment to refer back to the film footage of archival documents playing on screen. What I didn't mention earlier is that this footage shows almost everything that I did find and doesn't reflect the absences. My partner used the analogy of survivorship bias and the World War II Spitfire planes to describe what this film is doing. So during the war, these planes returned home with visible bullet holes where the aircraft had been hit. These visible hits were used as data to determine where the aircraft needed to be strengthened and reinforced. However, there was a problem with this. By only responding to the visible bullet marks on the planes which returned home, it ignored the important data held in the misses, the unhit areas of the planes, which all still returned home, implied that the planes that were hit in these places did not return home because these unmapped areas were in fact the most vulnerable, not the strongest. So similarly in this research, if we only pay attention to the things that we do find and to the things that we can see and that are visible, we potentially miss out on the even more significant information held in the things that we don't see. This footage can never encompass all the dead ends and disappointments. It can never encompass the frustrations and the overwhelming sense that some things just can't be found in the archives. And in not being present, these things have to be left to the imagination. The imagination is where I found most of my joy and I guess breakthroughs in this research project. And I'm constantly reminding myself that the information held in the gaps, the information that you can't see outside of your own imagination, is just as important as all of these hits that you can see on the screen. I loved to imagine Lloyd Record and Lynn Bram in Glasgow and Edinburgh in the early 1950s, imagining the people they met, the experiences they had, imagining them in dance halls turning heads or maybe trying to blend in, imagining the places they might have stayed or the communities they might have been part of. I also imagine what it must have felt like to have most likely been the only person of colour in this huge Scottish show, an experience I also know quite well myself. I imagine what it must have felt like to perform a role that wasn't ever referenced in the script, to never be included in any of the press photography for the show, and to leave a project as if you didn't exist. But I also imagine what it must have felt like to be on the stage and in the theatre as people with such a huge love and respect for theatre and performance. Lloyd Record came from a theatre family, as well as his own work in theatre. His brother, Barry Record, was a well-known Jamaican playwright and one of the earliest Caribbean writers to make a contribution to theatre in Britain. And Lynn Bram, 33 years later, was still involved in theatre and wrote a play that presumably was produced and performed. I imagine Lloyd and Lynn deciding that invisibility wasn't enough for them and taking pen to paper to create their own platform for their voices to be heard, much like Berto Pasuka and the dancers in La Bale Neg. I imagine the moments when they might have come across each other and the recognition they might have felt, just as I do right now, feeling pride in the knowledge of our presence, walking the path started by those who were here before us. Another day in the archives, this time reading Hamel the Obeahman. A thought that occurred to me while reflecting on my findings when looking at the term sambo-coloured. Time shrinks in the archive. Reading a book written in the 1820s, looking at the term sambo-coloured, that seemed to find its false origins 100 years later in the 1920s. Reading a play written in the 1950s, which references a colonial situation started in the 1700s. Reading another play written in the 1800s and looking at a programme for its performance in the 1980s at what is now the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, a place where I have worked in the 2020s. Reading a Scottish play written in the 1700s and looking at the programme for its performance in the 50s, looking up an actor in the 50s, in Scotland and finding a playwright in Jamaica, looking up a televised interracial kiss in the 1950s by the same Jamaican actor and playwright, and finding a white Scottish leading lady who started the theatre company 784, which was started in 1971, reading about the legacy of the theatre company 784 and meeting Black and POC performance makers who I have known and worked with in my own professional career in Scotland over the last 18 years. Legacies are timeless, and this can be felt in a myriad of ways. White supremacist colonial histories solidified in the 1700s are still very much felt now in both the silences and the very loud words of hate we hear these days, sometimes on a daily basis. But the Black histories of culture, resistance, and creativity are also felt across time too. My time in the archives has just reminded me what I already knew and felt, and will say it one more time. It reminded me that we are here, we have been here, that Black artists, performers, practitioners, and people have a rich and beautiful, imaginative, and resilient history here. Thank you.